I woke up in my hospital bed after my surgery. I was completely alone. "All right, Jessie, you're going to start feeling a little woozy." I was too focused on the surgeon to notice his assistant sticking a needle into my arm. By the time I even realized, it was already pumping me full of anesthesia. "We've got you hooked up to a good cocktail of drugs. Just try to relax into it." His words already began to jumble in my ears, slowing down and drifting into an incomprehensible mess as the anesthetics quickly took its hold. Before I could register it, I was completely unconscious. I had been preparing for this operation for months at this point, male to female genital reassignment surgery. An incredibly invasive procedure, but one I had been dreaming of having for years. A cure to so much that was wrong with my body, I was lucky enough to get with a good surgeon, one out in New York who specialized in this kind of thing. I was even luckier to have my insurance approve it. I don't even know what saint was looking down on me that day, but I'm not one to question good fortune. I had been closely following all of the instructions my doctor had been giving me leading up to it. Certain medications, the halting of hormones, and a generous diet of Gatorade and laxatives was prescribed. By the time the day of the surgery came, I was honestly looking more forward to finally getting to eat something solid than getting the procedure done in the first place. The surgery itself took place in its own special clinic, found on the outskirts of New York. Everyone there was incredibly nice, and the building was specialized to fit my needs. When I entered on the day of the surgery, I was rushed through, made to sign a series of documents, and finally put under the knife. After what I believed to be 8 hours, I was slowly dragged back to consciousness. I was lying on a hospital bed, the IV still placed into my arm, and a tube uncomfortably shoved up my nose. I started to panic. There had to be a key or anything that could get me out of here. I shake the handle over and over again, hoping that maybe something would change on my 100th try, but to no avail. My next thought was to break open the window, but that wasn't possible. I already felt like I was going to faint just from standing up. There was no way in hell that I had the strength to smash a window. I decided my next step was to ransack the room. I clung to the wall for dear life, making my way back around before stopping again at my hospital bed. There was nothing there. Same thing for the next hospital bed and the next. They were all completely empty. Frustration turned to fear as I came to the realization that I may very well die here. There was a group of cabinets across the room, so I checked there next. Taking the long way around, of course, clinging tightly to the wall the whole time. I threw open everything I could find. Every cabinet, every shelf, every drawer. I checked them all 100 times, but the answer remained the same. The key wasn't here. Of course it wasn't here, I knew it all along, but I didn't want to accept the fact. The key was in the operating room. Whatever was in there wanted me to come in from the start, so of course it would use this opportunity to finally close its grip on me. It was stupid to go in there, but I had no choice. I shuffled over to the door. I was at the precipice of a black void. I stood at the front, looking in, and just as I thought, there it was. On the arm opposite to the IV was a blood pressure monitor that would tightly squeeze my arm every couple minutes. I could feel 2 tubes painfully connected to my lower region. The room was surrounded in darkness, like looking into another dimension. It crept itself up around the walls and the floor and everything, so that I couldn't make out a single speck of what used to be there. In the middle of the room sat a single hospital gurney, illuminated by a single lamp above it that looked as if it were the light of God. Sitting on that gurney, just as I expected, was a single key. My instincts didn't want me to go in there, but my body began to move without my control once I saw that key. All I could focus on was that thing. It dragged me in, and once it had its hooks on me, my only thought was getting closer. I didn't have a wall to hang onto this time, but somehow I stayed up straight, through sheer force of will and desire, and whatever was dragging me towards that key. It was all I could think of, all I ever knew, ever wanted. As I got closer and closer, the light above it began to flicker and dim, but I didn't care. What I needed was right there. It would get me out, it would save me. I started to reach for it before I even got there, my arm outstretched, longingly trying to grasp it. I don't even think I remembered to breathe. My mind was just subsumed by the object, not its use, not escaping, just the key, just moving closer. As my outstretched arm began to reach it, a mirror appeared from across the hospital gurney. A hand similar to mine, its veins stained with the same black liquid that was in the IV. Its nails were long and unkempt, a deep crimson nail polish barely hanging onto it. The same colored nail polish as me. It was reaching over at the same time, mirroring me exactly. One was almost certainly a catheter, and the other, I believe, was a drain. My first step was to open my eyes, but even that was harder than it needed to be. But it wasn't reaching for the key, it was reaching for me, going to grab my arm, going to pull me in closer. Seeing this hand broke my concentration on the key for just a second, and then my vision began to face towards the ground. My legs gave way, and soon enough, I was on the floor. I tried to grab onto the gurney to stabilize myself, but that just resulted in it falling down with me, the key being flung to the other side of the room, right outside the door. I felt my pelvic region explode as my stitches burst open. My bags of bodily fluids had fallen beneath me as I fell, exploding and covering me in my own piss and blood. It was disgusting, and I couldn't differentiate between what was old blood and what was fresh. At least I was out of the trance I was in before, and I could see the room clearly. There were these dark figures in there, crowded together, making up the walls with their mass, made up of the same void as everything else. That indescribable dark that subsumed all light around it. They had no features, nothing. I could also make out the features of the original hospital room that this one had overtaken. I came to a realization then that the dark pit that had been there from the start was never some portal to another dimension. It was just them. These creatures, so large in mass and number, littered the room in so high a volume that it appeared as if they were all it ever was. That is to say, there was no black void, only them. Watching me from the start, I could hear my heartbeat in my ears at this point. I wanted to scream and cry and curl up into a ball with all this pain and fear, but I couldn't. My eyelids resisted heavily against any kind of force, seemingly wanting to stay closed. It took almost a minute of considerable effort before I could crack open a tiny slit and finally look back out into the world. I had to leave. I could hear them, the figures, I could hear their indecipherable whispers and groans. They were coming closer. I slid my body back around towards the door and began to crawl. Slowly but surely, grabbing the smooth hospital floor for dear life, pulling myself along. My crimson blood trailing behind me, being absorbed into the murky void that populated the room. I could feel them coming closer and closer. It felt like these things were grasping desperately at my legs, pulling at me, but somehow they had no strength to do so. It was like being slapped with water. They were trying to pull me back, pull me into their domain, but they were powerless now. All they could do was futilely grab at my calf. This kept going as I slowly crawled towards the door, the portal that would get me out of this deep pit, until finally I made it. I grabbed the key and pulled myself through. As soon as I made it out, the incomprehensible whispering stopped and was replaced with a beautiful silence. A silence that was almost louder than the commotion that had come before. Complete, beautiful silence. I crawled towards the door that led outside, my trail of blood and piss still following behind me. The blood starkly contrasting with the pristine hospital floors. I made my way to the door, to my freedom, and tried my best to get myself up towards it. It felt impossible, pulling myself up. My strength was almost completely gone at this point, and there was no question about trying to get up on 2 feet again. I had to drag myself up the door, the same way I dragged myself across the floor. The room was pitch black, and it looked like it was night out. I was facing directly towards the roof. Handprints full of blood and the greasy black substance covered it as I made multiple attempts to drag myself up, before finally I did it. The key went in smoothly and made a satisfying click as I turned the lock. With the last of my strength, I pulled the handle down and dragged the door open to the bright, beautiful morning sunlight. It didn't take long for someone to find me. You stand out pretty easily when you're crawling down the street, delirious, covered in blood, half naked in just a hospital gown. An ambulance was immediately called, and I was put under emergency surgery to fix my burst stitches. It was terrifying waking up again from the anesthesia. I felt the same grogginess as last time, struggling against everything to just open my eyes. It was terrifying, but once they were finally open, I could see that the lights were on and I was safe. My father came over shortly after, and he took care of me for the next couple days, not wanting to risk another incident. Once I could speak legibly, I spoke about everything that had happened. A couple cops were sent down to the clinic, but they didn't find anything. Not a single person or entity could be found, just my trail of blood staining the floor. The official report was that it was some sort of insurance fraud, that the whole clinic had taken all the money from the surgery and ran. It made absolutely no sense, but it's not like they believed my story. The doctors and the police all chalked it all up to some post-anesthesia hallucinations, that the dark had played tricks on me in my delirious state. But I know what I saw, I know what happened. So that's why I'm posting here. I need help or advice or something. I need closure, I need to know what happened. I attempted to move my head up and get a better look, but that task was more impossible than opening my eyes. It felt as if a force was dragging my body into that bed, making it extremely difficult to move any of my limbs. At the very least, with considerable effort, I could move my head to either side. On my left, I saw a row of empty hospital beds lined up in formation next to each other. To my right were two doors, one that led outside the building and one that led back to the lobby. Both closed shut. There was also a window that was covered by a blackout curtain, but the little light that shone through it was able to reveal to me that my initial assertion was wrong, and it was still day outside. I was completely alone in this room, my only company being the beeping of monitors hooked up to my bed. That's when the pain got even worse, a splitting pain in my lower region, a sign of a successful surgery, but still pain nonetheless. I could feel every inch of my body that had been cut up and rearranged and stitched back together. I could feel the plastic of the tubes that had been roughly inserted into my body. Each breath was agonizing, and each movement made the pain even worse. I knew what I had been getting into, of course. I knew it would be incredibly painful. But there had at least been the assumption that this surgery would come with copious amounts of prescription painkillers. At that moment, though, I had nothing to hold back the pain. I gritted my teeth and tried to breathe through it until finally attempting to call out for help. Helgo, Hego? All my voice could produce were drunk, slurred words. Speaking them felt like trying to speak while underwater. The audible version of attempting to walk through mud. I tried again, but to no avail. Ist enigity there? It was clear that this would get my nowhere, so I just sat there. Teeth clenched, trying to breathe through the pain, and praying for help that would never arrive. The tube shoved up my nostril proved to be the most annoying of the devices I was hooked up to, making my nose drier than a desert and breathing a painful effort. I wanted so badly to rip it out, but I was scared of doing something wrong and messing up the whole operation. And so I sat there, lying down in terrible pain, just waiting and waiting for something to happen. Then I heard a noise, a subtle humming coming from across the room. I had almost fallen back asleep when I first heard it. It had been what felt like hours at that point. My pain had all but subsided into a dull and aching background noise. Not enough to make me want to scream like earlier, but not enough for me to just tune out either. Just something I had to sit with. The noise began to get louder, no, closer. It was coming closer to me, a sweet, calming, and melodic humming. It sounded like it was being sung by an older man. He couldn't have been older than 50. It would have been calming for me if it wasn't accompanied by the fact that whoever was humming the tune was getting closer. At first, I thought to stay hopeful. Maybe someone, anyone, was coming to help. At this point, the anesthesia seemed to have worn off a bit, and I was able to move my body a little bit more, and my eyelids didn't fight against me. I lifted up my head slightly off the pillow, using my left arm to support me. Finally, I could see the whole room. On the wall across from my hospital bed, there was a door to what I believe was the surgery room itself. Unlike the first two doors, however, this one was wide open. It was hard to look inside. Actually, it was impossible to. The room was devoid of any and all light, like a mini black hole had appeared and sucked out everything within. To the left of the door was a series of cabinets, containing pills and tools and everything a surgeon would need. To the right, another window, this one also covered by a blackout curtain, but at this point it seemed like it had already become nighttime anyways. The most prominent fixture was the lack of one. There was no person to accompany the humming. I could still hear it, it was getting closer, but I didn't know who was getting closer. Hello, who's there? Can you help me? The humming continued. At this point I could tell it was coming from within the operating room, from within that black void. I strained my eyes to look in, but there was nothing, no one. Just a deep, black darkness. Then, the pain started again, worse than last time. It felt as if my insides were being pulled out through my lower region. I could feel every stitch, every tube inside. Like every one of my senses had been cranked to 100. I tried to hold back my groans, but it was impossible at this point. My clenched teeth gave way to an incredible moan of agony. I looked around again. There had to be something, anything. But I couldn't move. I was frozen. Every attempt at movement sent another jolt of pain through my already exhausted nervous system. My head was stuck up in place, completely rigid, staring through the door. Then, something reached out to me through the void. A hand, covered in the same exact darkness as the room itself. The humming continued, this time a more menial, routine humming than a calming kind. The hand continued towards me. "Please, you have to help me. Call the doctor back over. Please, do something, anything." My pleas began to mix with tears as I became more desperate. I wanted the pain to end more than anything. I was terrified, but if whatever that hand was could at least end this, end my pain, I'd be okay. Whatever was on the other end continued, the same routine, humming as always. The hand stretched and elongated out of that darkness until it had long gone past the normal length of a human arm. It stretched and stretched, slowly coming towards me. A viscous black substance dripped off of it as it came closer, splashing onto the floor and covering the ground with its void. At this point, it was close enough that I could see something in its hand. A single white pill, sitting there, starkly in contrast with its holder. By now, my pleas had long subsided. The pain had only gotten worse, but my terror and confusion had stopped me from begging. I just sat there, crying and trying through all my power not to scream. My eyes were transfixed, mesmerized by whatever was in front of me, and my teeth were clenched shut in an attempt to power through it. At this point, the hand had reached me. It thrust up directly towards my face, pushing its disgusting black mud into my mouth, still humming as if this were a routine job. I could feel it prying into me as it forced my jaws open with very little effort. I tried to resist it, but every attempt intensified the pain throughout my body. Once it had my jaws open, it pushed the pill down my maw. I had no water, and I could feel every part of it as it slowly made its way down my already dry throat. I choked and gagged and almost vomited before, finally, swallowing it. The effects were immediate, and I collapsed back onto the bed, my pain gone. I could hear the hand slowly shrinking back, and the humming fade away as I slipped into unconsciousness. Only a single realization lay on my mind, one that I had somehow not realized until then. That was the same voice as my surgeon. When I drifted awake, I was sitting slightly up, a pillow beneath my back giving me support. I didn't know how, but someone had moved me. Even the tube in my nostril was gone, finally allowing me to take a full, deep breath. The light was on, and it looked like it was day out. To my left, I finally noticed her. A nurse, someone who could help me. I was elated, and my mouth curled to a weak grin. I couldn't make out much of her features, but I wasn't paying attention to her face anyways. My gaze focused itself on what was in her hands, a bowl of soup. The pain had overridden any thoughts of hunger, but now that I finally saw the food in her hands, it was all I could think about. I was so incredibly hungry. It had only been days, but it felt like it had been decades since I last ate. She picked up a generous amount of the soup with a spoon and lifted it to my dry and weak lips. It was one of the best things I had ever tasted. It's the kind of stuff you think of when reminiscing on your childhood, the kind of soup that makes you feel safe and at home. For once, I wasn't scared or in pain. I was just happy and comfortable, the warmth enveloping my whole body. The events of earlier were completely gone from my mind. Then my gaze turned up, away from the food in front of me, and I finally took a good look at the nurse. She was smiling, a wide, jagged, disgusting grin. Like she was trying as hard as she could to look kind, but still failing. Her teeth were eerily white and straight. The edges of her mouth curled unnaturally wide, and she was looking right into me with such elation and such joy. Looking into her eyes felt like staring into the same hollow void as the door. I didn't want to keep looking at her. I wanted to go back to the comfort and safety of the soup, but it was too late. As my eyes moved back down, I didn't see the same stew I was eating before. Looking at the nurse had broken my trance, and I could see it for what it truly was. It was black and rotten and stank like death, the necrotic smell you get when you pass by roadkill on the side of the road. I lurched back, not knowing what to do, and then the nurse was gone. I was back in the pitch-black room, the lights were off, and it was night outside. I sat there for a long time, speechless, not knowing if it was real or not. I tried to convince myself it wasn't, that this was all some trick of the long-gone anesthesia, that something was messing with my brain. I almost convinced myself too, but a sudden pain in my arm convinced me otherwise. It was a dull, aching soreness that originated from the IV currently inserted into my vein. The normally clear tube that had transported fluids into me was replaced by a pitch-black substance, originating from a newly replaced IV bag filled to the brim with the same dark viscous fluid. I sat there, stunned in fear, not knowing what to do. I could hear my heartbeat rising, slowly thumping in my skull, over and over again. A blunt sound that slowly got louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I didn't know what this was, but I needed it out now. I started by peeling off the tape, keeping it in place. I was too scared to rip it off fast, and so I took it slowly and methodically. This probably made it even more painful than it needed to be. After the tape was gone, all I had left was the needle itself. I gripped it tightly at the base, mentally preparing myself. I took a deep breath and slowly drew out the needle. I pulled, inch by inch, feeling every part of the long, thin metal as it left my arm, tugging at my skin. After a long minute, the IV was out. From the tip of the needle spurted the black substance, and I dropped it to the floor in disgust. I looked back down at where it had been, only to see a pool of blood mixed with murky black liquid quickly trailing out. I wanted to try and cover it with a bandage, but with no good substitute around, I elected to just wipe it on my hospital gown. Now, I could finally try and get my bearings. The first and easiest thing that I realized was that I had to leave as soon as possible. But that was easier said than done. I had still just undergone an extensive surgical procedure. Everything ached and pained in ways I didn't know were possible, but I still had to try. At least the hardest part was done, and my IV was out. I started by removing the blood pressure monitor hooked up to my arm. The Velcro came off easily, and the hospital monitor above me began to beep wildly from the lack of readings. It continued to beep like that for the next 5 minutes or so as I continued. I then looked down at my legs. I had the same 2 bags connected to me down there, one full of blood, the other of piss. There was no conceivable way of taking them out, so I grabbed them from the hooks on the side of my hospital bed and placed them on my lap. My next step was to stand up, but I couldn't exactly figure out how to do that. My upper leg muscles were completely destroyed from the surgery, and it was impossible to move them. No matter how much I willed it, they remained steadfast against my brain power. I decided to make my arms do the work instead. Trying to keep my legs as close together as possible, I lifted and swung them over the side of the bed. Then, holding onto my 2 bags, slid my feet onto the floor. It took considerable effort just to stay upright, and I immediately fell towards the wall. I used my arm to keep me up straight, sending a jolt of dull pain down where the IV had previously been inserted. Just standing was an arduous task, with the pounds of bandages over my lower region feeling as if they were pulling me down with them. My legs were sore and could barely even stand up. I sat there, leaning against the wall for a long moment, my right arm bracing against it, and my left holding both of those bags full of my fluids, before finally gaining the courage to begin walking. Trying to walk without being able to lift your upper legs is one of the strangest things I have ever had to do. You can't lift it up in order to walk as you normally do. Instead, you can only move the muscles below the knee. So I had to swing around my lower calf in this weird dance, only bending at the knee, swinging it to the side, and then around. Over and over, incrementally walking each time. It was the least painful method of walking I could find, but it was still excruciating nonetheless. I slowly moved like this, tightly clinging to the wall for what felt like hours. It took all my brain power not to just pass out. Eventually, I made it to the door to the lobby. Locked. Well, shit, I thought, and then I tried the door that led outside. Same thing, locked.